What happens when an employee asks for union representation during an investigative interview? Is the union steward simply a witness or an active participant? In this episode, we explore the origins of Weingarten Rights, what employees are entitled to, and why misunderstanding these rights can create significant legal exposure for both employers and unions.
Welcome to the HR Investigations Podcast, exploring the issues, challenges, strategies, and solutions. Sponsored by RPCHR and hosted by Natalie Ivey, an HR consultant, licensed PI, and author of the best-selling book, How to Conduct Internal Investigations, a practical guide for human resource professionals. And now, here's Natalie.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the HR Investigations Podcast, where we examine real-world challenges that arise during workplace investigations. So today, we're starting with the foundation, understanding Weingarten Rights. If you've ever conducted an investigative interview or represented a bargaining unit employee, such as a union steward maybe, or managed labor relations issues, you have likely encountered a request for union representation. But what exactly does that mean? Well, let's dive in here. Let's talk about the birth, if you will, of Weingarten Rights. This emerged out of a court case back in 1975, and it was a landmark case decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, and it was the National Labor Relations Board versus J. Weingarten Incorporated. Well, the court held that employees who are in a labor union, such as, and if you're not familiar with labor unions, I'll name a few here, like the Teamsters, United Auto Workers, International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Communication Workers of America. In other words, a labor union is a group that has established itself as the representative for a particular labor force. So as an example, up in Detroit with the auto manufacturers, the United Auto Workers are the representative for the workers who are working, let's say, on the assembly line, putting tires and dashboards and vehicles and that sort of thing. Okay, Teamsters, they are the union for truckers, transportation workers, and so on. And various labor unions are out there depending on people's occupations, but they are voted in and they become a representative for that particular labor force. So in the NLRB versus the Jane Weingarten Company back in the 1970s here, the Supreme Court held that when employees are representative by a labor union, they have the right to request representation during an investigative interview when they reasonably believe that discipline may actually result. Now, this wasn't simply about just having somebody that they work with just come sit beside them. It was really more about ensuring fairness in the investigative process. Well, when does the Weingarten right actually apply? Well, there are three elements that really have to exist. The first one, the meeting is investigatory, right? In other words, management is looking into some kind of scenario, usually some type of alleged employee misconduct, such as maybe employee theft. The second element is the employee reasonably fears some form of disciplinary action. That could be like a corrective action memo, level 1 counseling statement, written reprimand, whatever lingo you use in your organization, or possibly even termination of their employment. And the third element is the employee does request the representation. So what that means is they might say, well, hey, if I'm having to meet with, let's say, the employee relations manager, or I have to meet with the corporate security investigator, well, hey, I want my union steward there. Okay, so that's an example of them, quote, requesting representation. So a common misconception, management isn't required to automatically provide a union steward. Often they are referred to as shop stewards. Okay, the employee does have to request the union steward's representation. Well, what exactly is the role of a union rep? Well, many managers, unfortunately, believe that a steward needs to be just completely silent, like they should just sit there like a potted plant. That is not correct at all. A union steward has the right to ask clarifying questions of the investigator, or someone who's in management, let's say. You may not necessarily be in the role of an investigator, but the union steward has the right to ask clarifying questions. They can also seek clarification if a question is appearing to be confusing. They can advise the employee. They can provide information, such as maybe even pulling in the labor contract and pointing to, hey, page 17, paragraph 4, et cetera, and they may elaborate on that. They also can assist the employee in understanding even the allegations. Look, sometimes you have individuals that may not necessarily have perhaps a lot of education. They may have English as a second language, and they may not completely understand the reason why they're being brought in for the interview. So a union steward has every right to help their union member to understand what the allegations are. And the representative who is there, the union steward, as an example, is not merely just a note taker. They really are there to provide some meaningful assistance to the process. Now, while their participation in this investigative interview is permitted, there are some boundaries, and I like to refer to them as kind of some limitations. All right, what they can't do, they can't obstruct the interview. Now, in my experience, and those of you who've been listening to my show for a few years, I've been doing investigative work for a long time, and I've certainly had my fair share of investigative interviews where I've had some rather prickly union stewards. Sometimes they've just completely cut me off in my questioning, and they have even said to a union member, hey, don't answer that question. Well, they're not allowed to do that. They can't obstruct the interview itself. It is one thing if maybe the union steward is also an attorney who is actually representing the employee. Now, that's a very different matter, and those are really quite outliers. That doesn't happen too terribly often. Once in a while, maybe, but not too terribly often. They also can't turn the meeting into any form of collective bargaining. That's not what this is about. This is not a debate. This is not a negotiation. This is simply where they are here as the representative for their union member during an investigative interview where management is looking into specific allegations where there might be some misconduct. Also, the reps, they can't refuse legitimate questioning. Hey, if I have a question that unfortunately just is a very tough question, they can't just say, well, that's not a question that I think is a fair question. And they can't interfere in the way that you're asking your questions. No. And they also cannot in any way encourage dishonesty. Okay. The objective is really about the fact finding. So just keep in mind, they can't obstruct, they can't turn it into a negotiation, they can't refuse legitimate questioning from the investigator, and they also can't encourage dishonesty. All right. So what are some of the challenges that HR investigators typically face? Well, one of the big ones that I can point to is especially after a relatively newly elected union steward. A lot of times they're put into that role after, of course, a vote, and they've been selected by the union membership. And they really want to show that they're doing a great job. And I think that's a good thing. But sometimes they can get a little bit ahead of their skis. And sometimes they will grandstand a little bit. They may become a little bit more of obstructionists, and they don't really understand the lane that they need to stay in. And they go beyond those limitations, the 4 that I just categorized. What I would suggest if you have something like that come up is take a short recess. Say, union steward, I would like to take a moment to just step out into the hallway, if you would, please. I just wanted to have a one-on-one conversation with you. And then that is when you really talk about Weingarten. You also talk about roles and responsibilities. Say, look, this is a fact-finding meeting, and the questions that I've been asking are very legitimate fact-finding questions. And you've specifically engaged in some conduct that is not permitted. You're here as a representative for union member such and such. However, you've obstructed several of the questions that I've wanted to ask. That is not permitted. I just need you to be clear on that. All right, is that understood? All right, great. And then you walk back into the meeting, something like that. But that is one of the biggest things that I see. So what I would suggest also, even before you get into that prickly situation, is know who your union stewards are, especially the ones who've been newly elected. Have a meeting with them. Sit down, have a cup of coffee. You're really wanting to build a relationship with them. Look, they may be in a steward position for quite some time and, years. So it's really worth it to sit down, maybe even have a bite to eat with them, have a sandwich at your local sandwich shop, go into a neutral place and just meet with them, get acquainted. and help them to understand your process. Do a little bit of an orientation to how you do things, maybe in HR or employee relations, or if you're in corporate security or even a safety, maybe you're an HSE investigator, health, safety, and environmental investigator. But it's better to build a relationship with the labor union before you get into an investigative interview and before they start to kind of get out of their lane and engage in conduct that they shouldn't. Now, in the next episode in a series here that I'm covering on Weingarten, we're going to explore one of the most debated questions in labor relations. And that is, can a steward stop an interview and request a private meeting after hearing a question that maybe suddenly reveals the true nature of the investigation? So stay tuned. You're going to want to listen to my next episode. So that's it for today's episode. But before we part for today, I do want to just mention that my next investigations workshop is coming up on June 23rd and 24th. That is from 11 to 4 Eastern Time. And if you are looking for some SHRM credits or HRCI credits, that will give you 10. And also the early bird is going to soon be approaching here. So you want to make sure that you register for the upcoming 2-day virtual workshop. That'll be via Zoom with me facilitating it. And if you take advantage of the early bird, then you get a few things here. So let me name what you get. You get $100 off registration, and you're also going to get an author-signed copy of my book, which is How to Conduct Internal Investigations, a practical guide for HR professionals. And you're going to receive a certificate of training, and that means that it will show your 10 credit hours at the bottom. And then also you're going to get a digital badge that you can use in your socials, a certified workplace investigator digital badge. And then lastly, you're going to get an RPC swag bag. So it comes with a canvas tote with some of our RPC human resources swag inside. And then, of course, a spiral bound workbook that we send to you. So there's a lot of gear that you get. Take advantage of registering before the early bird that is coming up very, very soon. And details are in the show notes for today's show. So that's it for me for today's episode. Look forward to having you back at the HR Investigations Podcast. See ya.
Thanks for joining us today on the HR Investigations Podcast. Be sure to subscribe, like, and share the show with any colleagues who will benefit from our strategies and solutions. For free bonus resources, simply visit hr-investigations.com. And remember, if you'd like some help with improving your investigative skills, or if your organization is in need of an external investigator to help with a case, please get in touch with us. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.